Evelyn Grant. 90 years old, a retired medevac pilot who once flew into enemy fire in Vietnam, was just trying to pump gas at her usual spot in the quiet town of Riverstone. But that morning, peace shattered. A ruthless biker gang surrounded her car, mocked her service, and one of them dared to grab her arm. They thought she was just another frail old woman. They were wrong. Because the moment his fingers touched her coat, Evelyn didn't flinch. She pulled out a flip phone and uttered 3 chilling words, code red. He touched me. What happened next? It wasn't revenge. It was history. In just 30 minutes, the entire town and the nation would witness a transformation no one saw coming. Because that phone call didn't just summon help. It awakened something much bigger. You're about to see how one veteran's quiet defiance sparked a movement and changed a town forever. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's honor those who still stand tall long after the battlefield. The morning air in Riverstone was still cool, the sky a pale shade of orange as the sun crept over the hills. Riverstone's stop and fuel was nearly empty, as it usually was, at 6:45 a.m. Tyler, the young station attendant, leaned against the counter, sipping coffee, half asleep, until he spotted a familiar car rolling in the old white sedan with faded veteran plates. Evelyn Grant, 90 years old and still sharper than most people, a third her age, pulled into Pump 3 like she had every Tuesday for the past 25 years. She moved with deliberate steadiness, her spine impossibly straight for someone her age. Her gray hair was tucked neatly under a blue cap with an old military insignia stitched into the fabric. As she stepped out, Tyler greeted her the way he always did. "Morning, Miss Grant?" "The usual," she nodded. "Full tank, and none of that watered-down stuff you sneak in on Fridays." Tyler laughed, already moving to activate the pump. But the calm didn't last. The first motorcycle engine rumbled in from the road like distant thunder. Then came another. Then 3 more. Tyler froze as a convoy of matte black motorcycles, each one adorned with jagged silver decals, rolled into the lot like a pack of wolves scenting blood. Evelyn, still at her car, didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could feel the temperature drop 10 degrees in the silence they brought. The last to arrive was Blake Monroe. Leather vest open over a tank top, tattoos running down both arms, and mirrored sunglasses that made his eyes unreadable. He stepped off his bike with theatrical slowness, cracking his knuckles and grinning like he'd already won a fight no one had started yet. "Well, well," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Would you look at this, grandma's out for a little joyride." The rest of the Iron Fangs laughed. They spread out across the lot like a spill of oil surrounding Evelyn's car, without touching it yet. Evelyn glanced at the side mirror and saw them all. She didn't flinch. Didn't stop pumping gas. She simply said, calm and clear, "I won't be long. You should leave." "Oh, we're not in a rush," Blake replied, walking closer. He noticed the veteran plates. His grin widened. "Vietnam, huh? That's cute. Did you make sandwiches for the boys or just take notes?" Someone snickered. Another muttered something about nursing homes. Evelyn locked the nozzle into place and capped her tank. "I flew medevac, pulled bodies out of places even you wouldn't dare to step into." Blake tilted his head. "You saying you were a soldier? I'm saying I served," she replied. "And you should step back." But Blake didn't. He moved closer. Too close. He reached out, gripped her arm, not hard at first, but enough. Enough to test. Enough to mark territory. His voice dropped a register. "You don't tell me what to do, lady. You don't get to act like you matter here." Evelyn's eyes never left his. Her tone didn't change. She reached slowly into her coat pocket, took out a flip phone that looked as outdated as she was, and flipped it open. She pressed one button. "Code red," she said. He touched me. Blake frowned, releasing her arm. "You calling the cops?" Evelyn put the phone back in her pocket. "No. I'm calling someone who doesn't wait for warrants." The Iron Fangs looked around at each other, laughing again, but not as loud this time. Something about the certainty in her voice hit different. Tyler stood frozen at the doorway, phone in hand, unsure whether to call 911 or record what might be history. "What's that supposed to mean?" Blake asked. His voice was louder now, but the edge of mockery was gone. Evelyn stepped back toward her car. It means she said you made a mistake. Blake's jaw twitched. You threatening me, you old hag? No, she replied. I don't make threats, I make promises, and you're about to see one kept. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then a single Iron Fang young, lean new to the group nudged Blake. She's bluffing. Blake nodded slowly. Yeah, probably just called her grandson. Still, he didn't look as sure as he sounded. Evelyn opened her car door and sat down, adjusting the rearview mirror. Her hands were steady movements, practiced. This wasn't the first time she'd faced men like Blake. It wasn't even the worst. She'd once landed a helicopter in a field lit only by tracer rounds. One loud man in a vest didn't even register. Back on the lot, the Iron Fangs started their engines. Blake hesitated before joining them, staring at her through his tinted lenses. Then he spat on the pavement and kicked his bike into gear. You'll regret this, lady, he muttered. Evelyn didn't respond. She didn't need to, because 30 minutes from now, the town of Riverstone wouldn't be the same. And Blake Monroe was about to learn that there are some people you don't lay hands on, not because they'll hit back, but because someone much worse will. Evelyn didn't watch them leave. She didn't need to. Once the last roar of motorcycle engines faded into the hills, she closed her car door and sat still for a moment. Then she reached into the glove box and pulled out a keyring with one small brass tag, worn, scratched, but still legible. Drake 511. She traced the edge of it with her thumb, then drove home without saying another word. Inside her small house on Maple Street, the morning sun filtered through lace curtains and landed on framed photographs, medals, and a dusty old helmet resting on a side table. Evelyn sat in her armchair, her phone still open in her hand. The line was dead now, but the connection it made had already traveled farther than any cell tower could reach. And just like that, her mind drifted back Vietnam 1968. The air was thick with smoke and humidity, the kind of heat that soaked into your bones and stayed there. Evelyn, only 33 at the time, sat behind the controls of a battered UH-1 Huey Fingers, white-knuckled around the cyclic. The mission was madness. No visibility enemy fire all around, and a landing zone barely wide enough to set down a picnic blanket. 5 minutes out, she said into her headset. Bullets tore past the windows as the chopper dropped into a ravine, trees whipping by just feet from the rotors. The voice crackling in her ear belonged to a young officer pinned down with his squad 2nd Platoon Echo Company. Ma'am, we've got wounded. They're not going to make it unless someone pulls us now. I don't care how bad it is out there. Evelyn didn't respond. She adjusted the throttle and dropped the Huey lower. When she landed, it wasn't smooth. The skids slammed into wet mud and enemy rounds punched through the tail boom. But she held steady. Her crew jumped out, dragging in wounded Marines as fast as they could. One of the last to be loaded was a lieutenant with a bloody tourniquet on his leg and smoke in his lungs. He looked up at Evelyn through half-blind eyes and said, "You're insane, lady. Shut up and get in," she'd told him. Back in the air, the chopper rattled like it was falling apart. One engine light blinked red, and part of the windshield was gone. Evelyn didn't blink. She flew them home under cover of darkness and pure instinct. That lieutenant's name was Samuel Drake. He spent 6 weeks in recovery and made it out alive because of her. 2 years later, he showed up at her transfer station in Da Nang with a 6-pack of warm soda and a framed photo of her chopper surrounded by Echo Company. "You saved our asses," he said. "That was a suicide run. I'm still here, aren't I? You shouldn't be." That wasn't courage, that was borderline crazy. She shrugged. Sometimes the difference doesn't matter. Drake didn't smile. He took the photo from under his arm and handed it to her. "I'm serious. You ever need anything? Anything, I don't care what decade it is. If someone lays a hand on you, I'll bring hell with me." She laughed then. She didn't think much of it. Soldiers made promises. Promises made in war rarely outlived the noise. But Evelyn kept the photo. And she kept the tag from his old duffel bag, the one she found wedged under the co-pilot's seat the day they lifted off from that cursed clearing. Back in her living room, Evelyn stood slowly and walked to the mantel. She picked up the photo in its cracked frame, the same one from that day in Da Nang. The men in that picture, those that were still breathing, had scattered across the country after the war. Some went back to quiet lives. Some never escaped the jungles. One of them, however, had not disappeared. Samuel Drake didn't retire into obscurity. He didn't fade into civilian life. He built something else, something quiet, disciplined, and capable. He called them the Liberty Riders, veterans like him who never quite left the battlefield behind. And when the world didn't understand them, they created their own code. They protected the forgotten, the overlooked, and sometimes the ones who didn't know they needed protection until it was too late. Now, after half a century, Evelyn had called in that promise, not because she wanted revenge, but because she could see what was coming. She had been around enough young men like Blake Monroe to recognize the pattern test, the weak, push the vulnerable, then burn everything that wouldn't bend. Except she wasn't vulnerable, and she wasn't alone. She placed the photo back on the shelf, straightened her spine, and walked to the front door. Somewhere on the highway outside town, engines were already roaring, not like Blake's pack of chaos, but a coordinated thunder of disciplined riders rolling with purpose and silence. Samuel Drake had promised her hell. Now he was bringing it. By noon, Riverstone's highways shimmered with heat. Out on Route 6, a low growl began to rise, not the chaotic sputter of outlaw engines, but a deep, synchronized thunder. It was steady tight and unmistakably deliberate. 48 motorcycles appeared in formation, riding in 2 perfect columns. No chrome, no flashy decals, just matty black machines, each bearing a single emblem, an eagle's wing wrapped around a service chevron. At their front rode a man in his 60s with white hair beneath a half-helmet jaw clenched like stone. Colonel Samuel Iron Sam Drake didn't ride like a leader returning. He rode like someone collecting on a vow. He hadn't come to speak. He had come to settle a promise. At the edge of Riverstone, they didn't slow. The column flowed like a trained unit peeling off down side streets, engines humming in unison. No horns, no signals, just precision. At Riverstone Stop and Fuel, Tyler stood behind the counter, head down, in a bored scroll through his phone. But when he caught sight of the first wave of bikes sweeping into the lot, he froze. Without thinking, he pulled out his phone, but for a few seconds he just stared, frozen. Then he remembered to hit the red button. His live stream blinked to life. The lead rider pulled in beside Pump 3, the exact spot where Evelyn Grant had stood that morning. Iron Sam stepped off his bike helmet in one hand and stared silently across the lot. His presence didn't fill the space with sound. It hollowed it out with command. The rest of the Liberty Riders encircled the station, taking up positions not with bravado, but with practiced readiness. There was no posturing, no yelling, just boots planted firmly and eyes scanning calmly like they were back in a war zone, only this time the perimeter was a gas pump. Tyler, still filming, whispered to his viewers. Okay, I don't know what this is, but it's not a regular biker gang. These guys aren't yelling. They're not here to party. This is different. Comments began trickling in. Why would vets surround a gas station? Is this a protest or a military reunion? This isn't random. Something's about to drop. The number of viewers climbed rapidly from dozens to hundreds in under 5 minutes. The footage was silent, tense, and oddly mesmerizing. What people were seeing wasn't spectacle. It was control. The camera caught Tyler's hand trembling slightly. I think they're here for something serious, he muttered, as the riders continued to hold their positions without a word. More viewers joined. The comment stream turned frenzied, but still no one could figure out the exact reason behind the show of force. No news reports, no official statement, just a growing presence that filled the space with a tension that felt military in nature. What made the video go viral wasn't violence or shouting, it was what didn't happen. 48 disciplined men had arrived like a strike team and simply stood watch. It was unnerving. And hypnotic. The number hit 15,000, then 30,000, then 50,000. And the world watching from screens across the country began to whisper the same question: who were they here for, and why this place? From that point on, the tone shifted. speculation turned to awe, because one thing became clear: Riverstone wasn't the kind of town where you lay a hand on someone and walk away untouched. The footage, silent but loaded with implication, became a symbol of something deeper. The idea that even in forgotten towns, someone still stood watch, that somewhere in the noise of daily life discipline still had a face. Back at a roadside bar on the edge of town, Blake Monroe watched the stream unfold on mute. The room around him, once buzzing with cheap laughter, had gone still. His crew huddled around the phone, uncertain. The power balance had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Blake stared at the image on the screen. He didn't say a word. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a burner phone. He scrolled until he found a number he hadn't used in years. He pressed call. 1 ring, 2. Someone picked up. "I need backup," Blake said. "No colors, no questions." A pause, then a time. A price. Nothing more. He hung up and stood. "They brought soldiers," he muttered. "Fine. Let's see how they handle what I bring next." Because Blake Monroe wasn't done. And what he was about to summon wouldn't ride in formation, it would tear through lines like wildfire. It was 1 a.m. when the first flames flickered in the heart of Riverstone's quiet downtown. The wind carried a scent of gasoline, a sure sign that this wasn't some random act of arson. Blake Monroe watched from the shadows, his eyes narrowing as the fire ignited the first of 5 storefronts. He had given the order. The fires were meant to send a message not just to Evelyn, but to anyone in town who thought they could defy the Iron Fangs. As the blaze spread across the commercial district, the crackling sound of the fire mingled with the distant sirens that were too slow to catch up with the chaos. Inside the local shops, panic was already setting in. Residents rushed from their homes, some shouting for help, others simply standing frozen in fear, as the fire quickly engulfed the small businesses that lined the streets. The lights of Riverstone flickered in a final effort to stave off the dark before succumbing to the overwhelming threat. Blake Monroe stood with his crew, a grim expression on his face, as he surveyed the destruction. The fires were nothing personal. This was just business burned the town to remind it of who was in charge. He didn't care about the victims. Not the owners, not the innocent bystanders. But the damage would be felt. Riverstone would burn. However, in the midst of the flames, one person wasn't waiting idly for the firemen. Kyle, a former biker and one of Blake's old crew members, stepped out from the crowd. His expression was different, now filled with a mix of regret and newfound resolve. Kyle had left the gang years ago, tired of the life and the violence that came with it. He had settled into a quiet life, running a small motorcycle repair shop in town. But now, witnessing the destruction of the businesses he had once admired, something stirred within him. The first person he saw in the chaos was Noah, the owner of the corner store. Noah had been trying to save his shop when the fire began, but the heat was too intense, and he collapsed from the smoke. Kyle didn't hesitate. He rushed to him, pulling Noah to safety, dragging him out of the line of fire with strength he hadn't realized he still had. Bloodied and battered, Noah gasped for air as Kyle helped him stagger to the side of the street away from the heat. But as Kyle struggled to help Noah, the Iron Fangs were watching. A group of Blake's men, their faces hidden behind bandanas, approached, their eyes narrowing at the sight of Kyle's defection. They had known Kyle in their previous lives as one of their own, and the betrayal was an unforgivable sin in their world. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Kyle, one of the bikers, spat, stepping forward. "You're not going to save a civilian, are you? You're one of us. You were supposed to help burn this town down, not play hero." Kyle didn't respond. He couldn't. The words felt wrong in his mouth. He had been part of the violence for so long, but now all he wanted was to make it stop. The 2 bikers didn't wait for an answer. They lunged, their fists landing on Kyle's ribs with brutal force. He tried to shield himself, but the punch sent him crashing into the pavement. Before he could recover, another biker kicked him in the ribs, breaking his arm with a sickening crack. Pain surged through Kyle's body, but he gritted his teeth, refusing to scream. He had been in worse situations before. He had fought harder battles. But this was different. The anger in his eyes turned cold like steel as he realized the full weight of his decision. He wasn't going back. Not now. Not ever. Noah, who had been watching the attack unfold from the safety of a nearby alley, coughed weakly, his chest heaving from the smoke. "Kyle. Kyle," he shouted, but his voice was barely audible over the fire. Kyle's heart pounded as he lay on the ground, his broken arm twisted awkwardly beneath him. The sound of the fire roaring around them almost drowned out the voices of the bikers, but in that moment Kyle made a choice. He couldn't go back to the life he had known, not after all the harm it had caused. If there was even a chance of stopping the chaos, he would fight for it, even if it cost him everything. He shifted his position, wincing with the pain, but he didn't allow himself to show weakness. He turned to Noah, his face set in determination. "Get out of here, Noah. Get to safety." Noah's eyes widened, disbelief written all over his face. "What are you talking about? We need to..." Kyle cut him off, his voice steady, despite the pain. "Get out. Now." Noah hesitated, but the urgency in Kyle's eyes pushed him to his feet. The older man staggered off his hand, clutching his side as he disappeared into the smoke. The bikers, still standing above Kyle, smirked. But that smirk faded quickly when they realized Kyle wasn't backing down. He wasn't the same man they once knew. And now, with the fire behind him and a promise in his heart, Kyle was ready to face whatever came next. Even if it meant standing alone. Because tonight, the flames might be consuming the town, but the real fire was just beginning to burn within the hearts of the people who had been left behind. As the fires blazed, so did the internal conflict within Blake's ranks. Not everyone in his gang was as committed to his cause as they had been. By 8 a.m., the fire crews had extinguished most of the damage. Smoke still lingered in the Riverstone air, mixing with the smell of scorched wood and melted plastic. The town was bruised but not broken. At the center of it all, the town hall stood firm, an old brick building with faded flags fluttering in the warm morning breeze. Inside, Evelyn Grant sat at the head of a long table, posture, straight eyes locked forward. She wore no medals, no uniform, only a clean navy blue blouse, and a presence that demanded attention without needing to raise her voice. The room was filled with residents, business owners, and veterans, men and women who had spent the last 12 hours watching their town burn. At Evelyn's right sat Colonel Samuel Drake, silent but alert, his jaw tight from lack of sleep. On her left was Linda Park, a former military intelligence analyst who now ran Riverstone's library, but had once mapped entire insurgency networks from a dark command center overseas. No one spoke for a long moment. Evelyn let the silence sit heavy and deliberate. Then she stood. "They tried to shake us last night." She began, her voice calm but cutting. "Tried to teach us fear. But here's the truth: we've already seen worse, and we're still here." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. She let it settle before continuing. "We don't fight back with chaos. We fight back with coordination, with structure, with something no street gang can ever match: discipline." She stepped aside and motioned for Linda to rise. Linda tapped a remote. The projector behind them lit up with a map of Riverstone. Color-coded zones, numbered blocks, business names, alley routes, all of it sharp and clear. Linda's voice was steady, professional. "We're launching Operation Shield," she said. "Starting now, every business in Riverstone will be partnered with 2 veterans. Each zone will have a command unit. Radio surveillance points, panic protocols, all deployed by tonight." Sam Drake leaned forward. "We're not here to intimidate. We're here to stabilize. That means no weapons unless absolutely necessary, no confrontations without cause. We are not a militia. We're a shield." Hands went up. Questions came fast. Evelyn answered them all with quick, clear logic. No, they weren't replacing the police. Yes, the authorities had been notified. No, they weren't asking civilians to fight. Yes, every pair of veterans had been screened and trained. No one left the hall confused. They left with assignments, checklists, and routes to memorize. But not everyone in the room was who they seemed. Near the back, seated between a local grocer and a city zoning officer, was Harold Kent, special advisor to the mayor. Well-dressed, quiet, and seemingly engaged. But as Evelyn outlined patrol timings and security protocols, Harold was memorizing more than he should. He smiled at the right moments, nodded thoughtfully, and clapped when the town hall applauded Evelyn's closing statement. Then, 15 minutes later, He stepped into a restroom stall, locked the door, and pulled out a burner phone. "They're deploying vets to businesses tonight," he whispered. "Zone rotation every 4 hours. Command posts at East and West Park. That's all I have for now." A voice on the other end responded with a single word. "Good." Harold flushed, pocketed the phone, and stepped out into the morning like nothing had happened. Back inside the hall, the energy had shifted. People who had arrived, frightened, now walked with purpose. Maps were copied, radios distributed, and volunteers began moving through the town like clockwork. Evelyn watched from the upper balcony, eyes following each detail. She didn't miss a beat. Linda approached quietly. "You think there's a leak?" she asked. "There's always a leak," Evelyn replied. "That's why we didn't give them the real plan." Linda blinked. "You diverted the timeline." "I diverted the timeline, the post locations, even the rotation schedule. If they act on what they heard today, they'll be hitting empty streets or guarded traps." A pause. Then Linda exhaled, impressed. "And if they don't, then we're still ready. Either way, we control the board." Colonel Drake joined them. "You expecting them to strike tonight?" Evelyn didn't hesitate. Not just expecting, counting on it. Because she knew something the gangs didn't. She wasn't playing defense, she was baiting them forward. And when they came thinking they'd caught her people by surprise, they'd find themselves not in an ambush, but inside a perimeter built by professionals. That night, the Iron Fangs made their move, but Evelyn Grant hadn't gone to sleep. What they thought was retaliation was actually the beginning of a trap. The Steelbridge warehouse sat on the outskirts of Riverstone, a forgotten husk of corrugated iron and broken windows. Once a freight hub, it now served a darker purpose. Inside, the air was heavy with gasoline, gun oil, and tension. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Blake Monroe paced beside a folding table, jaw-tight eyes twitching with frustration. His crew stood nearby, quieter than usual, their leather vests suddenly looking thin in the presence of what waited inside. Across from Blake sat Richard Voss, ex-military, now freelance muscle for hire. His beard was trimmed to regulation length, his stance too rigid for a civilian. He wasn't here as a soldier. He was here as an operator. Next to him stood a man who hadn't offered a name. But the tattoos told the story. Cartel. Sinaloa, probably. Maybe offshoot. Either way, this wasn't just firepower. This was infrastructure. "This isn't what I asked for," Blake muttered, finally breaking the silence. "No," Voss replied. "It's what you need." The unnamed cartel man placed a tablet on the table. A map of Riverstone lit up color-coded zones, distribution routes, logistical bottlenecks. It was clinical detached. To Blake, it looked like a diagram of his home being carved into pieces. "We've identified 6 viable points for relocation," the cartel rep said in quiet, accented English. "Your crew maintains presence on the surface. We handle the flow underneath." Blake frowned. "The flow of what does it matter?" Voss said flatly, looking him dead in the eyes. "You didn't bring us in to win some street feud, Blake. You called us because you're losing, and now we're here, which means Riverstone isn't your backyard anymore. It's an asset, one we intend to use." Blake tried to hold on to the illusion of control. "We had a deal. I get backup. You help me level the town and keep it under us." Voss almost laughed. "There's no us, Blake. That's the part you missed." Then the cartel rep spoke again. "We're not here for your pride. We're here for the pipeline." The room went still. "What pipeline?" one of Blake's lieutenants asked. Voss tapped the tablet. "State Route 9 rail proximity, no major enforcement presence, low-cost land. That makes this town perfect for storage movement and transfer. It's already mapped and logged. You're not building an empire, Blake. You're leasing a corridor." Blake's face turned red. "So what am I, a mascot?" No, Voss said. "You're the billboard. Locals think they're still dealing with bikers, not logistics teams. That keeps things quiet, clean, efficient." The truth landed hard. All along, Blake had believed he was orchestrating chaos to reclaim control, but he wasn't the conductor. He was the distraction. The moment he brought in outsiders, he had opened the door to something far worse than local retaliation. A cartel doesn't settle for turf. It absorbs it. The map on the tablet zoomed out. Riverstone sat like a blinking hub in a much larger network feeding into cities hundreds of miles away. Blake's turf war had become a node in a supply chain, and he was standing in a warehouse that wasn't his anymore. He looked at Voss. "This isn't what I signed up for." Voss smiled without humor. "You signed up for force. This is what force looks like." Across the room, two men began unloading crates not of ammo, but of surveillance gear, encrypted radios, tactical medkits. This wasn't a gang operation. This was an occupation. Quiet, systematic, ruthless. Riverstone wasn't under siege anymore. It had been seized. It hadn't even made the evening news. As Blake watched the cartel operator hand out assignments to his own people, non-uniformed, fluent in English, indistinguishable from locals, he felt the last thread of control slip from his grasp. His name might still echo in alleys and bars, but the decisions were no longer his, because what had started as a turf war had become something else entirely. Riverstone was now a gray zone, not just lawless, but strategically forgotten. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the warehouse lot. What rolled in next wouldn't wear leather or ride loud bikes. It would wear plain clothes, carry encrypted tablets, and speak softly while rearranging everything beneath the surface. And Blake Monroe, once the predator, now sat in the corner of a game he didn't know how to play. But Evelyn Grant did. She had lived through this kind of quiet takeover once before, half a world away, and she hadn't forgotten a single tactic. The morning after Riverstone's quiet surrender, Evelyn Grant stepped out her front door, dressed like any woman her age, sensible shoes, pressed trousers, soft beige cardigan. She carried a cloth bag over one arm and a cane in the other, more for show than need. Her posture was straight, her eyes sharp behind old glasses. She looked harmless, forgettable, ordinary, and that was the point. She started her walk at 8:04 a.m. sharp, down Maple Street, past the bakery, past the corner grocer where she stopped for a half-gallon of milk she didn't need. She chatted briefly with the clerk, an unassuming man with a warm smile and an Iraq war tattoo under his collarbone. As she exited, she held the door 2 seconds longer than usual, long enough for the ceiling camera barely the size of a coin to capture the black SUV idling across the street. Every step Evelyn took had a purpose. She paused at the park bench near the bus stop, fed the birds like she always did, and pretended not to notice the unfamiliar van parked along Willow Street windows, tinted front grille too clean. She moved on. The town looked unchanged, but the rhythm was off. Children still walked to school. The bakery still smelled of sugar and warm bread. But the townspeople spoke softer. They looked over their shoulders more often. And every storefront had a subtle addition, a fire alarm box that wasn't really connected to sprinklers, cameras behind flower arrangements, mirrors angled not for decoration but for surveillance. Voss knew she was walking. He'd been briefed on her routine. From the moment the cartel had started moving equipment into Riverstone, she had taken this exact walk every morning. Regularity, after all, was vulnerability. And so he watched her through static-free radio chatter drone surveillance and a rotation of shadowed observers in parked cars. But Evelyn wasn't hiding. But she was daring them to watch. Because while she fed the birds, a micro camera in her bag was capturing the license plates of every vehicle that had followed her twice in 1 week. While she stopped for coffee, the newly rewired ATM next to the register pinged faces to a secure server run out of the old high school basement. A school that no longer had students, but now served as a command post. Even the park's duck pond had a sensor embedded beneath the bench, triangulating audio whenever cartel phones buzzed nearby. Evelyn didn't walk for exercise anymore. She walked to bait the trap. At 9:16 a.m., she passed by Dawson's Hardware, where a window sticker advertised military discount, a quiet signal that the owner was cooperating. From the upstairs apartment window, a former Navy comms specialist tracked 2 cartel men posing as road crew across the street. At 9:29 a.m., Evelyn paused at the church steps. She tied her shoelace left-hand slow movement long enough for the sniper across the street to spot the rooftop observer who had been there 3 days in a row. That rooftop sniper hadn't moved, but the town had adjusted around him. Evelyn's slow walk wasn't just a loop. It was a line being drawn quietly around every cartel operative trying to move through Riverstone like they owned it. By noon, Voss grew uneasy. He sat in the back of a surveillance van chewing his lip as he watched Evelyn pause again in front of a florist. She leaned in to smell a vase of wild chrysanthemums. "Why does she keep doing the same route?" he muttered. "She's predictable," said one of his men. "No," Voss said, narrowing his eyes at the screen. "She's broadcasting." His suspicion was correct, but too late. Because the same florist Evelyn visited had recently received free Wi-Fi hardware from a grant program that didn't exist. It was a signal amplifier. Every time Evelyn lingered, data flowed quietly, steadily to a secure uplink. The entire town was listening, watching, recording. She wasn't just repeating a habit. She was feeding a network. She was the antenna. Across Riverstone, former Marines, Rangers, analysts, and engineers worked in disguise, some behind bakery counters, some at the park, some in delivery uniforms, but all were connected, and all were waiting. Every shift Evelyn made, every vehicle that tailed her, every man who looked twice at a bench or an alley or a utility box captured, tagged, logged, evidence stacked in gigabytes. By late afternoon, the cartel's presence had grown, but so had the trail they left behind. Too subtle to spot in one moment, but devastating when seen in full. Evelyn returned home precisely at 2:00 p.m. She placed the milk in her fridge, set her cane by the door, and then walked to a shelf lined with dusty cookbooks. She pulled one out. The wall behind it clicked. A panel slid open, revealing a hardened tablet, encrypted and connected to the local network. She tapped the screen once. Lines of code lit up. A message blinked. Surveillance sync complete. 113 targets flagged. 41 priority. Evelyn sat down slowly, folded her hands, and waited. Riverstone looked quiet, but it was now the center of a counterintelligence operation hiding in plain sight. Everyone was in position. The only thing missing was a signal. And when it came, it would be one word passed quietly down the line. Stormbreak at exactly 9:00 p.m., the town of Riverstone plunged into darkness. No warning, no flicker, just sudden total black. Every streetlight, house traffic signal gone. Silence followed. Not confusion, not panic. Silence. It lasted 4 seconds. Then, with a low mechanical hum, beams of white light cut through the night like knives. Floodlights, powerful and deliberate, ignited across rooftops, lampposts, even park sculptures. The darkness didn't fade, it was shattered. Every cartel safehouse meeting point and transit route was lit up like a stage. From the old steel mill to the newly leased warehouse on Ellsworth Road, high-intensity spotlights fell squarely on their targets. Static crackled across scrambled comms. Cartel lookouts, caught like prey in headlights, scrambled for cover, but it was already too late. 4 unmarked helicopters circled above Riverstone. 2 of them bore no insignia. The other 2, however, carried 3 letters the cartel operatives instantly recognized: DEA. From the shadows beyond the light, trucks rolled in with silent precision. Armed agents dismounted, vests on, weapons drawn, not shouting, not rushing, just moving clean and controlled like professionals executing a plan they'd rehearsed a dozen times. At the same moment, from the opposite ends of town came another sound, the deep, low thunder of synchronized engines. The Liberty Riders. Their bikes didn't roar this time. They flowed silent as rolling thunder, flanking the perimeter of Riverstone, in a formation tighter than any patrol unit. 48 veterans, each positioned at choke points, intersections, and fallback exits. Not to fight, but to seal. No one in, no one out. Inside the Steelbridge warehouse, cartel lieutenants scrambled to destroy evidence, hard drives, documents, cash. But within minutes, the warehouse doors were blasted inward by tactical charges, and DEA agents stormed the building. Richard Voss stood in the middle of it all, unmoved. He didn't reach for a weapon. didn't issue commands. He simply raised both hands slowly and turned toward the nearest spotlight. "You'll want the laptops in the north corner," he said to the agent who cuffed him. "And the wall panels, there's fiber line running under the floorboards." The agent gave him a confused glance. "Why cooperate?" "Because this was never my war," Voss said calmly. "It was logistics. And the job's over." Across Riverstone, doors were kicked in, suspects dragged out. Flashbangs shattered windows where resistance flared. But most didn't fight. The sheer speed of the operation, the surgical coordination, it was overwhelming. By 9:23 p.m., 73 cartel operatives were in custody. Not a single shot fired. At 9:30, Evelyn stood on the balcony of the old town hall, eyes locked on the eastern ridge where the last safe house had been taken. She didn't blink, didn't speak. Around her, monitors buzzed with live feeds from body cams and drones. Linda Park stood nearby, reading off the arrest confirmations, her voice calm but tight. "South corridor clear. Warehouse 2 secure. Holding zone at the fairgrounds is full. We'll need secondary transport in 15. Iron Sam leaned on the railing beside Evelyn. "Clean sweep," he said, wiping soot from his brow. "They never saw it coming." Evelyn didn't answer, because something was off. No one had found Blake Monroe, and worse, no one had seen the vehicle. A gray truck. Boxy. Marked as a municipal service vehicle. Registered to a fake company. It had been parked outside the West substation for 2 days, unnoticed until now. It was gone. Evelyn's mind raced. "Pull satellite imagery from the last 2 hours," she ordered Linda. "Get me everything that crossed out of town limits," Linda typed fast. "What am I looking for? A ghost," Evelyn said. "A ghost with a detonator." Reports were still coming in. The cartel's communications hub had been captured. Their lieutenants were in custody. But the man who'd lit the fire to begin with, the man who had dragged Riverstone into this, was missing. And if the truck wasn't just loaded with gear? Evelyn's fingers tapped the railing in rhythm. Too deliberate to be nervous. Too fast to be coincidence. "He's not gone," she said under her breath. "He's waiting." Because this hadn't been Blake Monroe's final move. It had only cleared the board. Riverstone had won the battle, but the next explosion wouldn't come from the cartel. And Evelyn Grant had just realized the war wasn't over. The call came in at 2:12 a.m. A highway camera outside Riverstone caught a blurry image, a gray municipal truck turning off the main road toward the abandoned Maple Ridge construction site 5 miles from town, long since stalled by budget cuts and bureaucracy. The location was perfect. No neighbors, no traffic, no cameras. But Evelyn Grant had planned for ghosts. The moment the image hit the town's network, her command center snapped into motion. Evelyn, still in the same clothes she'd worn since the blackout, leaned over the digital map, voice calm but urgent. "He's going to rig that site as a statement. He didn't come to run, he came to end it his way." Colonel Samuel Drake, known across the region now as Iron Sam, stepped forward. "We intercept from 3 angles. He won't see us coming." Evelyn nodded. "No sirens, no lights. We don't want panic. We want silence and precision." Within minutes, 3 convoys moved through the outskirts of Riverstone, one led by Iron Sam, one by a team of veterans from Operation Shield, and the third by a battered pickup truck driven by Kyle. His arm still in a sling face, still bruised from the beating days earlier, Kyle had insisted on going. Evelyn had hesitated, but she understood something about redemption. Sometimes the person who broke away was the only one who could get close enough to stop the explosion. By 2:43 a.m., the site was surrounded. The half-finished apartment complex at Maple Ridge stood like a skeleton in the night. Steel beams glinted under pale moonlight. The truck sat parked near the foundation pit engine, still running. Blake Monroe stood beside it. He wasn't in biker gear. No vest, no colors, just a gray hoodie and jeans, hands, gloved eyes sunken. He looked less like a warlord and more like a man who had lost everything but rage. In one hand, a small black trigger wire coiled tightly. In the other, a flashlight scanning the shadows. He didn't see Evelyn step out from the brush 20 yards ahead, her hand's empty coat fluttering in the wind. "You know this won't end how you think," she said quietly. Blake turned, startled, but didn't raise the device. "Not yet." "I knew you'd come," he muttered. "You're always in the way, always pretending like you're saving people. You didn't save anyone. You just delayed the fall." "This isn't a fall," Blake Evelyn replied. "It's a town finding its backbone, without fear, without you." Behind him, Iron Sam's team moved in position. Quiet boots, no sound. Kyle crept along a collapsed walkway wind, whistling through rusted scaffolding. He could see Blake's silhouette backlit by the truck's headlights, the detonator gleaming in his hand. Blake stepped closer to Evelyn. "You think taking down the cartel wins you something? You think calling in the government, the feds, makes you safe, they'll leave. And when they do, people like me fill the cracks." "No," Evelyn said. "People like you create the cracks, but they don't last." Blake lifted the detonator. His thumb hovered. "You sure you're ready to die with me, Grandma?" But before Evelyn could answer, a voice echoed from the shadows. "Don't." Blake froze. Kyle stepped out from behind a steel beam, his gun raised. His face was pale, but his voice steady. "Put it down." Blake's eyes widened. You, Kyle, nodded. "Yeah? Me? You were nothing without me," Blake spat. "You were just another stray I picked up off the street. And you were the one who showed me how to survive," Kyle replied. "But surviving isn't the same as destroying." Blake's eyes narrowed. "You gonna shoot me? You think you're better now?" "No," Kyle said softly. "I'm just done following cowards." Blake snarled and pressed his thumb down, but the click never came. Kyle's shot rang out across the steel frame of the sight. It wasn't loud, just precise. Clean. Blake's hand jerked sideways, the detonator flying from his grip as he screamed in pain, clutching his shattered thumb. He stumbled backward, but Iron Sam was already there, pinning him, securing the perimeter. Evelyn exhaled slowly. The truck was swept. Inside were 400 pounds of military-grade explosive rigged to level the site and everything within 2 city blocks. By 3:01 a.m., it was over. Blake lay cuffed and groaning beneath floodlights. Kyle sat quietly on the truck's back bumper, his pistol lowered, his face blank. Iron Sam approached Evelyn and handed her the detonator, now cracked and useless. "No badge took him down," he said. "It was one of his own." Evelyn nodded. And that's exactly how it had to end. Because Riverstone hadn't won by brute force. It had won because someone who had once helped break the town decided to help save it instead. The last battle was done. But the mission wasn't over. Now the town had to rebuild stone by stone from the ashes it had survived. Morning in Riverstone arrived softer than expected. No sirens, no smoke, just sunlight filtering through trees and the gentle clatter of hammer against wood. For the first time in weeks, the streets didn't hold tension. They held purpose. The town square, once scorched and silent, now bustled with quiet motion. Buckets of nails passed from hand to hand. Wood planks slid off trucks. Old storefronts opened wide with their windows gone, frames stripped, insides dark, but no longer empty. Noah leaned against the frame of his hardware shop, a fresh bandage on his ribs and a crowbar in his good hand. He watched as 2 men, both with tattoos from a different life, hauled new drywall across the sidewalk. Kyle walked behind them, giving quiet instruction, his arms still in a sling. He moved stiffly but deliberately. His voice never rose. He didn't bark orders. He offered guidance. No one told them to show up. They came because they needed to. Evelyn stood across the street beside Linda Park, sipping weak coffee from a paper cup. She wore the same cardigan as the day before. Linda had offered her a new one. Evelyn declined. "Don't cover the smoke smell," she had said. "Let people remember it." They both watched as a group of men, ex-Iron Fangs, clearly marked by worn vests and weathered faces, cut away the burned remnants of the old bakery awning. Diana, the bakery's owner, leaned out from the doorway, and pointed to a stack of reclaimed tiles. "They're doing it right," Linda said, surprised. "They're doing it themselves," Evelyn corrected. Just after dawn, a group of them had appeared outside Town Hall. No press, no crowd, just a line of men waiting quietly for Evelyn to arrive. Some had bruises, others still had cartel ink that hadn't faded. Most didn't say a word, but when she stepped out of her car, they took off their vests. One man, a towering figure named Manny, who had once guarded cartel shipments, simply asked, "Can we fix what we helped ruin?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She'd stared at him for several seconds, the weight of the town's pain sitting between them like something physical. Then she turned to Linda. "Assign them. Tools are in the shed. No power saws till we know who can handle them safely." Manny nodded. "That's fair." And they got to work. By mid-morning, the sound of labor had spread through Riverstone, not just from former outlaws, but from the people they once intimidated. A mechanic who'd once paid protection fees now handed a socket wrench to the man who had extorted him. A grocer stood on a ladder retiling his sign, while a former Iron Fang held it steady from below. Kyle worked beside Noah measuring window frames. Neither said much. When they finally did speak, it wasn't about the past. "Need a guy who knows wiring?" Kyle asked. "I need someone who shows up," Noah replied. Kyle nodded. "Then I'm here." Linda turned to Evelyn, who hadn't stopped scanning every street corner, every face. "This wasn't the ending I expected," she said softly. Evelyn didn't blink. "It's not the ending. It's the decision to start again." Some of the veterans kept their distance, watching arms crossed, not entirely ready to forgive. Others joined in 1 or 2 at a time, teaching proper bracing angles, showing how to square a door. Forgiveness wasn't given all at once. It was measured in inches in planks laid in sweat earned. And for many in Riverstone, it wasn't just about fixing buildings. It was about taking control of something that had been stolen dignity. From a distance, it almost looked like a miracle. But Evelyn knew better. Miracles didn't walk into town in leather jackets with their heads bowed and calloused hands open. Miracles didn't ask for forgiveness. People did. And the most powerful ones were the people who had once torn things down and were now asking to help rebuild. That afternoon, Evelyn and Linda sat on the courthouse steps, watching a dozen ex-Fangs help repaint the wall that had been vandalized the night of the first fire. "Do you think this holds?" Linda asked. "Do you think they stay?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then, "Not all of them. But some will, and maybe that's the point." At that moment, an old black SUV pulled up beside the square. The engine cut. The door opened. Richard Voss stepped out. He wore no vest, no weapon, just a plain shirt and jeans, hands empty, expression unreadable. He walked across the square past townspeople who slowed and stared, past Kyle, who froze mid-hammer, past Manny, who straightened but didn't speak. Voss stopped at the edge of the work zone, then looked at Evelyn. "I heard you're hiring," he said, "because sometimes the strongest sign of change isn't who builds first, it's who shows up last. And Riverstone wasn't finished yet." The walls of the Riverstone police station still smelled faintly of scorched wiring and fresh paint. Power had only been fully restored the day before. But now in the narrow conference room behind the front desk, Evelyn Grant sat across from the man who had once helped orchestrate the town's near destruction. Richard Voss. No cuffs, no guards, just 2 chairs, a chipped table, and a conversation that neither of them had expected to happen. Voss didn't fidget. He sat with the same calm composure he'd displayed in war zones and safe houses. The only difference now was the absence of calculation in his eyes. Instead, there was something else, hesitation, perhaps, or shame. Evelyn leaned forward, folding her hands. "You asked for this meeting. I'm listening." Voss nodded. "I'm not here to bargain." "Good," Evelyn said, blunt. He let a beat of silence pass. "I spent most of my adult life selling violence to the highest bidder. Clean ops, dirty ops, it didn't matter. I didn't ask questions. Just hit objectives. You hit this one hard." Voss looked down, jaw tight. "I did, and I thought I was doing what I was trained to do, but something about this town, this job—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. It was the first time the damage stuck with me. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "You mean guilt?" "No," he said. "Not guilt. Clarity. I've fought for pay for politics for ghosts in boardrooms I never met. But Riverstone, this was different. I watched people fight for free. For each other. Not for leverage. For community. I haven't seen that since my first tour in Afghanistan before the lines blurred." Evelyn didn't blink. "And now you want to join the people you once helped destroy. I want to help protect what I almost helped ruin," he said, voice steady. "Not as a cop. Not as a soldier. Just as someone who knows how systems collapse and how to keep them standing." She studied him. "You want to fight again?" He shook his head. "No. I want to serve." Another silence filled the room, the kind that weighed more than words. "You understand," Evelyn finally said, "there are people in this town who'd never accept you. No matter how many storefronts you help rebuild." "I'm not asking for their forgiveness," Voss replied. "I'm asking for their protection. I want to stand between this town and whatever tries to break it next. And if that means I earn trust one block at a time, so be it." Evelyn tapped the table once, thinking, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folded map, an overlay of Riverstone showing new security routes, restructured response zones. She slid it toward him. "Colonel Drake has final say, but the Liberty Riders are stretched thin. We've got 4 open slots for field support non-combat. Surveillance, logistics, technical response. You're overqualified for all of it." Voss looked at the map, but didn't touch it. "And you all be watching," she said. He nodded. "Fair." She stood to leave, then paused with her hand on the door. "You said this was the first time you wanted to fight for something clean. That's not a small thing to admit." "It's not a small town," Voss replied. As she walked out, he finally unfolded the map. For the first time in years, his next objective wasn't a building to breach or a person to silence. It was a town to protect. A professional killer had chosen of his own free will to defend the very streets he'd once helped mark for destruction. And as Evelyn would soon learn, he wouldn't be the last. 3 weeks after Riverstone's final battle, the town hall filled once more not with panic or anger, but with purpose. The smell of burned insulation had faded, replaced with fresh paint, new flooring, and the warm scent of coffee brewing from the back table. The chairs were full not of strangers anymore, but of neighbors, business owners, veterans, volunteers, and people who had once stood on opposite sides of barricades now sitting side by side. Evelyn stood at the front, flanked by Colonel Samuel Iron Sam Drake and Linda Park. Her cane rested against the podium unused. Her voice, though soft, carried through the room with conviction that could not be taught. "This isn't about restoring what we had," she said. "It's about becoming something we've never been before." Behind her, a large screen showed a new layout of Riverstone, divided not by turf, but by collaboration. Color-coded zones for community patrols, medical response units, business watch programs, and youth mentorship initiatives. At the heart of it all was the new command center, a repurposed schoolhouse now running 24/7, with former military ex-gang members and civic leaders sharing radios, maps, and responsibilities. Linda stepped up next, pointing to a blinking grid. Every block now has a responder team made up of 2 veterans and 1 civilian, all trained in basic first aid, conflict de-escalation, and crisis coordination, not enforcement support. James, once known as Snake, now wearing a reflective vest with civilian guards stitched in yellow rows from the crowd. "And we're not armed. That was the first thing I asked." "And you know what? It works. People don't flinch when they see us anymore. They wave." A chuckle rippled through the room. Sam nodded. Trust doesn't come from weapons. It comes from showing up, again and again, rain or shine, without ego. One shop owner, Carla Mayfield, stood. We don't lock our doors like we used to. Not because we're naive, but because we know someone's always nearby. That's never been true here until now. Kyle, still healing, but ever-present, passed around a stack of flyers workshops for conflict resolution, peer support, mental health training. Programs he now co-managed with Sarah Chen and other Liberty Riders. A town once under siege, now trained for resilience, not reaction. Linda added, "We've started a mentorship program pairing at-risk youth with former gang members who turned their lives around. They're learning mechanics, cooking, woodwork, even civic law." "Does it work?" someone asked. James looked up. "They're not running from cops anymore. They're learning how to stand for something instead of just fighting against it." There were quiet nods around the room. Trust, fragile as glass, and twice as rare, was being passed hand to hand. Not in speeches, but in sweat, in repair work, in difficult conversations. Outside the hall, signs of transformation were everywhere. Storefronts once scorched were repainted with murals designed by schoolchildren. Biker bars had become repair co-ops. The warehouse where cartel shipments were once sorted now served as a community distribution hub for food, medicine, and donated supplies. The Liberty Riders were no longer just a security detail. They were part of the town's civic structure, training a new generation. In more than just defense, they were teaching patience, strategy, and responsibility. Evelyn glanced at the clock. "Before we close this session, I want to remind you all, rebuilding doesn't happen in city council chambers. It happens every time you hold a door open for someone you once feared. Every time you knock on your neighbor's door, not because there's trouble, but because there isn't." A pause. "And if people out there ask how a burned-out little town turned itself into a blueprint, tell them it wasn't politics. It wasn't money. It was this," she tapped her chest. "Something cartel dollars couldn't buy. Something no gang ever gave." She smiled faintly. "Trust." As the meeting ended, no one rushed out. They stayed, talked, organized cleanup crews and book drives. A town once cracked open by fear, now cemented together by earned respect. Because Riverstone hadn't just rebuilt its buildings, it had rebuilt its people. And a year later, that miracle had a name. 1 year to the day after the chaos, Riverstone gathered beneath a new sky. The town square had been reshaped into something more than a plaza. It was a promise made of stone and steel. At the center stood a newly unveiled memorial, a bronze statue of 3 figures, one in military uniform, one in a mechanic's jumpsuit, and one in civilian clothes, standing shoulder to shoulder, with heads held high, etched into the base, unity over fear. The unveiling ceremony drew people from across the state. News crews, representatives from the governor's office, veterans, survivors. And in the front row, Evelyn Grant sat beneath a white awning flanked by Iron Sam, Linda, and a very different James than the one who'd once stood guard at the edge of darkness. Nearby stood Richard Voss, still quiet, still watching. But this time not calculating outcomes, just witnessing one. The ceremony began with a procession led not by politicians, but by Riverstone's Civilian Watch, an organization now composed of veterans, business owners, former gang members, and students. As they passed the crowd, applause rippled through like a wave, then something no one expected. A young man stepped forward, eyes down, hands clasped. Ethan Monroe, Blake's younger brother, his voice trembled but held. "I came today because I wanted to apply to join the patrol. I know what my brother did. I saw it. I'm not him. But I don't want to run from his shadow anymore. I want to help protect what he tried to destroy." A hush fell over the crowd. Then from the back, James stepped forward. The man who had once served under Blake. The man who had once feared this town's judgment. He looked at Ethan, walked up to him, and offered his hand. "If there's a place for me here," James said, "there's one for you too." Ethan's hands shook as he took it. No words from the mayor that day could match what that moment meant. Finally, Evelyn stepped up to the podium. She looked out at the crowd, many familiar, some new. All changed. 1 year ago, this square was a battlefield. Not of bullets, but of fear division, and the weight of everything we refused to face. We were outnumbered, outfinanced, outgunned. A pause. And yet here we stand. She scanned the faces, Voss near the edge, Ethan trying not to cry, Kyle in the second row with bandages finally gone, Linda holding a clipboard, but watching every word. Some say what happened here was a miracle. But let me tell you what I believe. That phone call I made, the one that started all of this, it wasn't a call for help. She leaned in slightly. It was a call to remind good people of who they were. The crowd was silent, hanging on her words. They didn't come to save me. They came to save themselves. To save what they'd forgotten mattered each other. And maybe they helped the enemy remember too. She placed a hand on the stone of the memorial. We didn't defeat them. We changed them. Not all, not easily, but enough. She stepped back, voice quiet but unwavering. And now when people ask what Riverstone is, we tell them it's not a miracle. It's a choice, a hard one, made every day, by people who remember what fear looks like but choose unity anyway. The applause wasn't loud. It was steady, earnest. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the lights of the square lit up like stars below, Evelyn sat on the same bench she'd used to rest during her walks a year before. Now she didn't need the cane beside her. Iron Sam sat down next to her. "You did it, Captain?" She shook her head. "No. We did. Them too." They watched as children chased each other through the square, passing under the shadow of the memorial, without noticing it. That perhaps was the real victory. They didn't need to remember what the town had been, because they were already living in what it had become. Riverstone had once been a warning. Now it was a blueprint, and all it had taken was one phone call. But not to save a single life, to save an entire way of living. And this time, no one was going back. They thought they were dealing with an old woman. They didn't know she carried history in her spine and a promise in her pocket. Evelyn Grant didn't just survive that morning at the gas station. She sparked something bigger. A phone call that wasn't a cry for help, but a signal. One that summoned not vengeance, but transformation. Because in Riverstone, the real power didn't come from fists or flames. It came from those who chose to rebuild, from former enemies who put down weapons to pick up hammers, from a town that refused to be defined by what broke it, but by how it healed. In the end, no badge, no headline, no rescue team saved Riverstone. People did. One by one, and that might just be the kind of heroism we need more of. So let me ask you this. If your town was under threat, not from outsiders, but from within, who would you call? Tell us in the comments below. What would your version of Evelyn's phone call sound like? And if this story moved you even a little, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because the world needs more stories where unity, not violence, wins the day.